Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6. Hope everybody's doing well. So, last week I had you guys look at the policy positions that the presidential candidates who are currently running have by visiting their websites. I didn't get you guys to look at all of them because there are still, so many candidates in the Republican Party. So I only had you guys look at Trump, Cruz, and Rubio from the Republican side, and then Clinton and Sanders from the Democratic side. It would also be worth doing if you have some time to look at John Kasich's policy positions, and Jeb Bush's as well, just to sort of get an idea, more comprehensive idea of what the spectrum looks like on the Republican side. Um, Obviously, it's been some big developments this past week in the presidential race, right? The largest, of course, is the death of Antonin Scalia, Supreme Court Justice. Because, as you remember, one of the primary responsibilities of the president is to nominate Supreme Court justices, right? So, of course, there's a big debate now regarding whether President Obama should appoint a Supreme Court justice. And, of course, a lot of it depends upon which side you're on, right? I mean, many um, people on the Republican side say that the president should not appoint a Supreme Court justice because it's in an election year and he's a lame duck president, and the people are going to make their wishes known regarding whether whether there will be a conservative or a liberal put into office, and that person should, based on the voice of the people, be able to appoint a justice with that uh, predisposition, right? And of course, it's important to remember that Scalia was one of the, if not the most conservative member on on the Supreme Court, right? So obviously, the conservatives, if someone less conservative or even if someone liberal were put onto the Supreme Court, it would be a big blow. And we're not going to talk a lot about the Supreme Court in this course, but it's important because there are 9 members on the Supreme Court, and um, currently, there are only 8, right? So there's no tiebreaker in there. It's essentially 4-4, right? So in the case of a tie, the Supreme Court would make a ruling, but it would not have the same force as it would if there were a majority. And usually, what happens is it reverts to um, the Court of Appeals underneath it, and that's the decision that is actually that takes precedent in that case, right? So that's why it's so important to have the 9th person actually in there, so they can actually serve as sort of the tiebreaker in these cases, right? And essentially, a lot of people would argue that currently the court is split 4-4. So this vote carries a lot of weight regarding a lot of um, constitutional questions that the Supreme Court's looking at now, regarding abortion rights, regarding the environment, regarding the Second Amendment. So it's a huge issue, and that just added a lot of skin into the game for this particular presidential race. So there's the question of whether Obama should appoint somebody. Of course, if you look in the Constitution, obviously you'll see that the president shall appoint. Right? It doesn't say that the president shall appoint except in their last year of office. Um, but of course, the other side of that is that, of course, the president appoints, but the appointee has to be confirmed by the Senate. And in this case, we have a Republican-controlled Senate. Right? So the likelihood, even if President Obama does appoint a Supreme Court justice, the likelihood that that justice will be confirmed is very low. Although there's an interesting dynamic too. There's a lot of things at play in this particular Supreme Court um, decision. Um, so perhaps one possibility, right, that could make sense for both parties would be if President Obama were to appoint a moderately conservative, less conservative than Scalia, but still moderately conservative appointee that the Senate Republicans could perhaps confirm. right? So in a way, you could see that as a win for both sides, right? So President Obama and the Democrats get a less conservative person than Scalia, while the Republicans still get someone who leans more to the Republican conservative spectrum, right? But there's a wrinkle to that, right? Because what the Republicans are really hoping is that a Republican will be elected in November. And if Republicans elected in November, and there's still and this is an important point, there's still a Republican-controlled Senate, because there is a possibility there are going to be lots of Senate elections in November. There's a possibility that the Senate could go back to the Democrats. All right, so this notion that if there is a Republican elected, a very conservative Republican, let's say Ted Cruz, for example, if Ted Cruz were elected, he would appoint a very conservative Supreme Court justice or Supreme Court nominee, right? I think that's pretty obvious. And if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, then they could confirm that nominee, and then there would be a very conservative justice, similar to Scalia, perhaps even more conservative, on the bench. And the major questions of Roe v. Wade, the environmental question that's being considered now with the Paris agreements, all those things would likely tilt more towards the conservative interpretation of those issues. So that's one possibility, right? And that's sort of the ideal scenario for the Republican Party and for the conservative movement. The other scenario is that in November the Republicans don't win the election, right? And you have a Democrat who wins, right? And it's more like it's likely, regardless of whether that candidate is Clinton or Sanders, and probably even more so in the case of Sanders, that there would be a very liberal, or certainly a liberal, justice appointed or nominated to be the next Supreme Court justice. Now, the nightmare scenario for the Democrats or for the Republicans would be that if a Democrat wins the presidency and the Democrats get control of the Senate, then they will be able to confirm someone who is very liberal, right? So you've got sort of this prisoner's dilemma thing going on, of question of, in the case of President Obama and the currently Republican-controlled Senate, do we cooperate or not? It would seem like when you sort of weigh out all the scenarios that it would make sense for them to cooperate, but most likely they're not going to, right? So anyway, that adds a lot of complexity and a lot of importance to this election. So an already very important election just got more important. Okay, anyway, so I asked you guys to sort of go to all the websites and just sort of get a general sense of the policies, both at an individual level and sort of from a Republican versus Democratic perspective, right? And obviously there are a lot of policies on each one. Although interestingly, some candidates have less issues than others that they discuss. Some have some major issues they discuss, and they have some supplemental issues underneath that. And then some just have a laundry list of 30 issues. So it's interesting to think about why that might be the case. But we certainly noticed that on the Republican side there were less issues that were actually discussed, with the exception of Rubio. Rubio by far had the majority of issues that he addressed on his website. Trump had the least, right? I think he had 4 or 5, if I remember correctly, which is really interesting that he only had that many issues listed. And of course, it makes you wonder: is it because he hasn't fully thought out these, or is that a strategic move? And it probably is a strategic move, because a lot of people think that Trump is not the most conservative candidate. Right? He's not your traditional Republican. Right? So if he's trying to win the Republican base, it may make sense for him to pick and choose the issues that he thinks sort of go with the Republican Party more, and highlight those on his website versus posting others like his stances on abortion, for example, where he's flip-flopped many different times. Right? So perhaps a strategic move. Although you do get some really interesting insights into what's important to Trump. Right? From an economic perspective, we've got his policies on China, where he's going to the art of the deal, right? He's going to get China to the table, and he's going to make sure that China gets in line, right? And then you have his tax proposal, which is also interesting. It's sort of simplifying from 7 codes currently into the 4 that he talks about. And another thing that's interesting, pretty much across the board on the Republican side, was this idea of abolishing the estate tax, right? So essentially, if your family, if you're in the Gates family, right, and Bill Gates dies and his wife dies and their money goes into an estate, currently that estate, before it were passed on to the next relatives or whatever, would actually incur a 40% tax, and they actually want to do away with that, right? So the idea is that you earned the money, you deserve to keep it, right? Of course, the counter argument to that is essentially you're building sort of, if you allow that to happen, you're building sort of this dynastic system, right, where the wealthy pass on money to the wealthy, and you have these sort of dynasties that emerge, which can lead to sort of the wealth and income inequality. So you got Trump talking about that. Cruz, right? Cruz is talking very much about, obviously Cruz is the evangelical candidate, right? And his page focuses primarily on family values, so marriage between a man and a woman, right? Being pro-life versus pro-choice. Strict interpretations of, what he calls strict interpretations of the original intent of the framers of the Constitution, although there's a lot of research out there and a lot of smart constitutional scholars who don't think there's such a thing as one original intent of the Constitution, right? James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and all the framers of the Constitution all had very different ideas on what the Constitution actually meant and what it actually did, right? So sometimes this notion of an original intent of the Constitution can be a bit misleading. And from an economic perspective, the interesting thing about Cruz was, and this is sort of something that you can look at as a distinction between all of the Republican candidates, is their tax policies, right? What they're suggesting to do with taxes and Cruz, rather than sort of this simplified version of the tax system that Trump provided. Cruz actually makes it even more simple, right? He just argues that there's going to be a flat tax, so everybody, regardless of their income level, is going to be taxed at 10%, right? That's Cruz's thing. Let's see. If I remember correctly, Cruz said on his site that everybody is going to be taxed at 10%, right? So even people that are making, way below the poverty level are essentially going to be taxed at 10%, right? So the idea is that everybody, I think what he says is everybody should have skin in the game, right? So even if you're making minimum wage, you're still going to be taxed at 10% of that, which Trump doesn't do that. The bottom percentage, Trump says there'd be no taxes for, and Rubio says the same thing. Okay, so Rubio was I thought his policy page was interesting because there's definitely some deviations from the Republican norm. First, he has more issues. So by far on the Republican side, he has the most comprehensive policy proposals, right? Once again, he thinks that the estate tax should be done away with, so that's a similarity that he has with the other Republican candidates. He talks about seniors. That's one of his major issues, right? He talks about making sure that Social Security is still there for the seniors, making sure that Medicaid is still there, which is interesting considering that those are entitlement programs, and primarily, for the most part, Republicans are actually opposed to this idea of entitlements, right? Government actually stepping in and taking care of people's basic needs. He talks a lot about families, right, and giving actually tax credits to families that have small children to help them sort of when the child is born and new costs. He talks about giving tax credits to businesses that actually provide paid family leave. So in a lot of ways, Rubio's positions, I would say, are actually more nuanced than some of the other positions. Businesses, he said there would be no higher than a 25% tax on businesses. Trump said 15%. So there are some slight variations between those three candidates on the Republican side. Obviously, another big issue that we heard a lot about in the recent Republican debate, and we've heard a lot about all the way through, is immigration, right? Of course, Trump, and now they've all said they're going to build a wall, right? So that sort of Trump came up, led the charge on that, and now everybody's sort of falling in line behind this idea of we're going to build a wall. Both Trump and Cruz say that they're going to triple the numbers of ICE employees, which kind of goes against this idea of big government, or not having big government, right? You're talking about tripling the size of a federal agency, so there's certainly going to be more government regulation. And Rubio doesn't actually give any numbers, but he talks about an increase in no percentages, but he talks about an increase of 20,000 workers in immigration and customs. Let's see. So one very stark difference between, and I'll get to the Democratic candidates in a second, one very stark difference between the Republicans and the Democratic candidates was the fact that a cornerstone of the Democratic candidates is this notion of income and wealth inequality and the role that big money plays in politics, right? So the Citizens United ruling, which essentially ruled that these super PACs, major organizations, can spend an unlimited amount of money on a particular candidate's campaign, as long as they're not in the form of direct contributions, but they can use them to create commercials. They can use them to send out promotional materials, things like that. So Citizens United said essentially that the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court said essentially that these are legal entities. Corporations, if you will, and they have the same rights as individual citizens, right? So, and of course, individual citizens in the United States have the right to free speech. So, because these entities are legal entities, they also have the right to free speech. And spending this money is a form of speech, right? So, not allowing them to spend however much money they want on these particular campaigns limits their free speech rights, their First Amendment rights. So, but both of the Democratic candidates say that is that's a major problem, and especially Sanders, right? That Sanders is essentially making that the cornerstone of his campaign, right? And Clinton is saying that, but if you actually look at how Clinton is running her campaign, she's getting a lot of assistance from super PACs. So she says that we're going to get big money out of politics, but she's taking big money right now. And I guess there are two ways to look at it. One, well, it's legal, so why wouldn't she use it? The other is that it's a bit hypocritical to say that, we should get big money out of politics and be taking big money at the same time, right? So anyway, but that's a big difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Republicans don't say anything about getting money out of politics, and the Democrats both say that that's a major issue. There are also some issues on the Democratic side that are not really addressed on the Republican side. Rubio touched on them because he had lots of different policies up there, but higher education, right? So we're talking about the economy, right? So on the Republican side, stimulating the economy, Trump says we need to clamp down on China, but also we need to change the way we're taxing businesses, small businesses, large businesses, to promote economic growth by essentially lowering taxes and letting the free market actually grow our economy. So that's more of the Republican argument of how do we actually improve the economy. The Democratic argument for how you improve the economy is a little bit more nuanced. So obviously there's an investment. There's a federal government investment in education. So we're getting a more educated workforce, which is going to grow the economy. There's also an investment in infrastructure, right? So we want to make sure that in order to stimulate the economy that we have the necessary tools to do so, right? So maybe it's putting in high-speed fiber for internet in certain areas, or maybe it's rebuilding roads or rebuilding certain areas where we think we want to really encourage the next Silicon Valley, let's say. right? So that's one of it. So it's increasing education. It's beefing up the infrastructure, right? And there's also this notion that goes along with this when you're talking about this notion of human capital, education, things like that. There's this major disparity. There's this wealth and income inequality, right? So there's not equal access to things like education. So a lot of people who are living, in poorer areas just don't have that access. So they're trying to put policies into place that sort of bridge that inequality that's there in order to strengthen the economy in that way by actually focusing on the sort of the human aspect of it and trying to control the economy that way. So it's just sort of two different approaches. One approach is, we lower the taxes on the businesses and let them do their thing, and the economy will grow. The other is that the government actually steps in and makes sure that the workers are educated and that the infrastructure is put into place to actually allow that economy to grow. Another major distinction between the two is this notion of climate change or the environment. Almost exclusively, you find that on the Democratic side. You don't see many discussions of the environment on the Republican side. It's interesting. I think maybe it was Secretary Gates, former Secretary of Defense, who declared that climate change was one of the greatest national security concerns that we have in the world right now. So, it's interesting that we often think of the Republican Party as the national security party, but yet there's very little mention on the Republican side of climate change, let's say, as a national security issue. Also on national security, interesting, I guess it's not surprising that the socialist candidate is the one who seems, I don't know if you want to say, the least aggressive. He talks about war as the last resort, right? And that's an interesting segment under his policies to read, because he talks about all the costs of war, right? Because he served as the Senate Veterans Affairs chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. So the hidden costs of war to the veterans themselves, not just the economic costs of actually waging the war, but what happens when they get back. And he talked about rather than the strength of a nation should not be measured by its ability to go out and wage war, but it should be measured by our ability to peacefully settle these disputes. And then he talks about why, and that's the rationale that he gives for supporting the Iran deal. So on the Democratic side, national security is much more about forging alliances with other countries and working cooperatively. On the Republican side, it's about amassing military might so we can act autonomously and independently. So two very different philosophies, regarding national security. And then you have to consider the Democratic side on taxes as well, right? So on the Republican side, you have this notion of lowering taxes on big businesses, let's say, and the wealthy. On the Democratic side, you have this notion of actually increasing the tax burden to the upper income levels, right? And that's because of course the Democratic Party has all these social programs they want to put in place, these entitlement programs, and that's how they pay for it, is by increasing more taxes on the wealthy, increasing the estate tax. So the Republicans want to completely do away with the estate tax. The Democrats actually want to strengthen or raise the estate tax. And then, of course, Sanders, one of his big policies to actually pay for all the reforms that he's talking about is to increase the taxes on Wall Street deals, right? Wall Street speculation, he calls it. So that's how he proposes to actually pay for that. So that's just, there are several, we could talk about this for a long time, but there are several different policies out there, and it's at least worth educating yourself on what these people actually say that they're going to do, right? And that brings me to my second part of the question, which was, do you believe that they're actually going to carry out those policies if they're in office? Well, there are a couple of ways couple of ways to think about this, right? The first way to think about it is that they're politicians, right? Everybody that's running for the presidential office right now, whether they're a career politician or not, are politicians. And there's a big difference between a politician and a social activist, or a political party and an interest group. The chief end or chief goal of a politician and a political party is to obtain political power, right? And the way that you obtain political power is, especially in a popular system of government, the way you obtain political power is by essentially pandering to the population that you believe gives you the best likelihood of being elected, right? So their issues are tailored to that aspect, right? They're saying the things essentially that they say that they think will actually get them elected. And there's also a major difference between what they say during the primary elections, because in the primary elections they're trying to primarily appeal to their parties, right? And their parties are, if they're Republican, the parties are primarily conservative, and if they're Democratic, their parties, their constituents are primarily liberal. So in the primaries, they tend to go to either, if they're Republican, they go to the far right, and if they're Democrats, they go to the far left. Right? So the policies that they're espousing now are going to be much more towards the left and the right. At least historically speaking, it may be different this time with Sanders and, let's say, Cruz or Trump or somebody like that. Traditionally, what happens in the general election is that the candidates start moving more towards the center, right? So their policies become less extreme because they're trying to appeal to that independent voter out there who sort of doesn't live on either the right or the left. So their policies will change in that regard. So that's one thing to consider about their policies and whether they're actually going to implement them. One of the things that I was trying to get at in my question was that one way to actually find out, where they actually fall on some of these issues would be to not just look at what they say are their, what they say is their agenda now, but to actually look at their voting records, because a lot of these people are either, governors, senators, things like that, so they have a track record of these things. So rather than just looking at what they're saying now, do a little historical research and find where they've come down on a lot of these issues, and that'll give you some guidance. The second way to look at this question is, and this is what a lot of people brought up in the discussions, was that the president doesn't make autonomous decisions, right? The Congress they're actually the ones who are the ones that are making the laws and shaping these particular policies. So the president can certainly recommend a particular policy to Congress, but ultimately it has to go through Congress if it's going to become a law, unless it's an executive order. As we've talked about, the president can issue executive orders that pertain to the federal agencies that fall under his purview. Right? And he can try to control things in that way. But whether they can actually get the policies through or not is it's not just their call. They don't just have the power. Congress has a lot to say about that as well. So there's a couple ways to think about how much stock you should actually put in the policies that they're putting into place, right? But there's policies, and then there's the question of character and trust as well, and that's usually what elections come down to, right? Who do you trust? And that's a very different. So you've got your rational sort of right brain, that measures the rational policy initiatives they're putting into place, and then you've got sort of the left brain that's looking at the character and, do I trust this person to be my leader, right? And usually the left brain wins out. So that's also something to consider when just looking at their policies. You also have to consider their character and whether they're actually trustworthy or not. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'm actually going to be on a political talk show this Sunday. It's going to be on Manatee Educational TV. It's a program called Beyond the Beltway. I'm going to be talking about the presidential election and other things that are going on in politics. So if you guys want to tune into that, I'll be on there from 8 to 9, I believe, but the program actually runs from 7 to 9. So not required viewing, but if you guys are interested in hearing more of my ramblings,